in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 10, there these words are found. It says, "Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this." Now, I want to stop just for a moment. I don't want to give you the idea that there's no hope. Because there is hope. And that's what this word is all about. That's the reason why we need to be exploring what this says and entrusting this message to our children and to encourage our friends, our family members, our neighbors to follow what this says. Because this is the book that has all the answers for life. Now, let's think for a moment of what it must have been like in those days, the teaching and the preaching of God's Word during those days. And let's start off in the Old Testament. Think about the life of a prophet. Because you see, the life of a prophet of God was hard. And it was hard because the message was often unpleasant. Now, we may find similar things going on today, but we can learn a great deal from looking at what the prophets had to go through. And just to give you some examples, Amos was one who faced great difficulties. David was one who would complain about his words being twisted or distorted. And that's brought out there in Psalms 56, verses 5 and 6. Jeremiah would face such opposition that he once wanted to quit after God had called him. And that's brought out in Jeremiah chapter 20, 7 through 10. The life of a prophet was hard. It was hard not only because their audience wasn't willing to follow what God says all the time, because the message went against the norm of society. People often will assign their problems to the bearer of bad news. And this was something that really is quite evident in the Old Testament. Remember Elijah and the situation that he had with the Baals? There in 1 Kings chapter 18. What's interesting is that Ahab would accuse him of being the troubler of Israel. Now, that's quite interesting, because you see, when you examine the context and you examine the results or the response that Elijah gives to him, Elijah answered in verse 18 and says, "I have not troubled Israel, but you, your father's house, have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed after the Baals." Now, what was Elijah doing? He was preaching against the Baals. In fact, he would have that little contest, remember, against the God of heaven and the Baals, and God of heaven won. And as a result of that, he slew all of the prophets of Baal. Yes, the problems that Elijah was given or assigned to was simply because his message hurt Ahab and those that would follow after him. We would see that the people wanted Jeremiah dead. In fact, that's brought out in Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 8 through 11. And later on in chapter 38, verses 3 and 4, one of the reasons why they wanted him dead is because he was destroying, or accused of destroying, the morale of the army. Because they weren't doing what God said. The leadership was not following what God had said. People will often assign their problems to the bearer of bad news. But you know, the prophets just had to tough it out. We would see that Isaiah would set his face like flint, according to chapter 50, verse 7. Jeremiah fortified himself in chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. And we would see that Ezekiel just had to be tough And that certainly is demonstrated there in Ezekiel chapter 3, 8, and 9. Yes, when we look at the prophets of old, we see that they had a difficult task. But as long as they continued to follow what God said, they succeeded. Now, what was it like during the New Testament? Well, I hate to say it, but it was quite similar. In fact, the powers of the nations did not support religious freedom in any way. It's completely different than what we see today. And I realize our freedoms may be under great threat, but even if we lose some of our freedoms as a nation, it still was nothing compared to the first century. We would see that the Jewish and civil and religious authorities, they claimed to be following God's word, but they were really more concerned with the traditions that they had. And you might recall the hand washing, the Pharisees that approached Jesus and wondering why the disciples didn't wash their hands before they ate, as is according to the tradition. That's brought out there in Matthew 15, verses 1 through 9. Or how Jesus would rebuke the Pharisees because they would hold to the traditions and make law as though God had specified those things, brought out in chapter 23 of Matthew, verses 1 through 7. Now, the society in the first century did not respect God's word, even those that claimed to be following it. And so what do we see? Well, the Sadducees, they opposed Christians. They were, I guess you would say, more of the civil leaders or rulers of that day. The Pharisees, more of the religious rulers, would lead the early persecution against the church. And these two groups would make up the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin Council would issue orders against the teaching of Christ. And those that presided over the Sanhedrin Council, the chief priest, they would issue orders to kill the people in the church. That's the first century. And yet, when you look into the, I guess you would say, Asia Minor area, the treatment in the Gentile cities wasn't any better to Christians. In fact, what we see is the provincial and city governments, they supported idolatry and the belief of multiple gods. And those that would preach against it, such as Paul, faced opposition. The magistrates there in Philippi had Paul and Silas beaten and thrown in prison, as Acts 16, 19 through 24 would bring out. And we would see that the Roman governor Felix, you might recall, delayed freeing Paul for 2 years in hopes of receiving a bribe. And when that didn't take place, and that's found there in Acts chapter 24, the beginning, around verse 22. But when that did not take place, his replacement, Festus, he kept Paul in as a political favor in prison longer. And you know, when you begin to look at even the Roman Empire, and of course, as we had brought out in our Wednesday night class by Brother Rod this past week, when you look at the Roman Empire, we know it was hostile towards Christians. In fact, officially it was polytheistic. That is, that they believed in many gods. And they had the various altars and statues that are erected towards them. And they eventually began to demand worship of its emperors. And this would also play a crucial role in the first century lives, or the lives of the first century Christians. Claudius, he demanded that all Jews leave Rome. And we know that Nero, as brought out Wednesday night, is believed to have burnt some of the slums of Rome, simply because he wanted to erect a bathhouse that was dedicated to his name. And when it came back upon him, he began to blame Christians for it, and he would set them aflame so that he could have light in his garden. And it would become so bad that under Domitian, we would see that food could not be purchased without proof that you worshipped the emperor. And this is brought out there in Revelation chapter 13, 16, and 17. Now, that's the picture of the first century, the hierarchy. What was it that they were so adamant against? What caused them to act in this fashion? Well, it was simply the preaching and teaching against the things of society. So what was going on in society? Well, certainly we would say that the culture or the morality of society was completely opposite than that which is found in the New Testament, which is found, I should say, even in the Old Testament. In fact, in the days of Peter, and as Peter would write in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, Peter would say that we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. Well, what was that? Well, he says, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. And he goes on to say, he says, in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They didn't understand the morality. They didn't want to understand the morality. All they wanted to do is to continue to do the same perverted things that they had done always. And so they spoke against him. And it would grow to this type of abuse that we have seen.